Thank you for joining us today for what will be an extraordinary, exciting, and insightful program. I'm Sheila Hollis, the Acting Executive Director for the United States Energy Association. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with USEA, we're a nonprofit, non-lobbying, nonpartisan institution founded in 1924. It's built on two pillars of equal importance. First, we convene, educate, serve as a key resource, as we're doing today for the American energy enterprise. And this entire forum is devoted to that goal. Second, we work in partnership closely with USAID, the Department of Energy, and the State Department. The goal is to better the lives of people throughout the world to provide them with affordable, clean, and reliable energy access. I'd like to thank our USEA Board of Directors, led by our fantastic Executive Chairperson, Vicky Bailey, for her support and encouragement over the past year, and for the rest of the board too. And of course, I want to express my gratitude for the unbelievable, unwavering dedication of the USEA staff. We're fortunate today to have a tremendous lineup of expert guest speakers with us who are at the forefront of energy technology, research, and policy. They are unique, brilliant, and their presentations promise to be more unique and insightful. I want to personally thank every one of them for taking the time to join us here today. We know your time is precious. Once more, we appreciate your attendance today, and we're ready to get underway. With that, let me turn it over to USEA Executive Chairman Vicky Bailey. Vicky? Vicky, you're on mute.
Okay.
There you go. Now you're on.
Thank you. Thank you, Sheila, for always taking care of me.
That's the extent of the capability.
I'd like to give a warm welcome to everyone in attendance today as well, and extend my gratitude to all of the guest speakers who will be joining us. This is our third Advanced Energy Technology Forum, the first of which was held in person in July of 2019. This event explores technological innovation throughout our sector from the perspective of national labs, corporations, universities, and government bodies. I'm happy to announce that we have an international audience joining us today. The ability to reach a global audience is certainly one benefit of today's virtual world. Last year's event, also held in September, had attendees from 33 different countries to tune in. We thank everyone tuning in from overseas, and we are especially grateful if it is really early or really late, wherever you may be. I'd like to thank Sheila for her incredible leadership and wisdom. We certainly are appreciative of her hard work, and we're very fortunate to have her. And her great help in making this event a possibility. And of course, I want to thank the USEA staff for organizing it. Informational dialogue on the current energy issues of today has never been more important, and events like this make that possible. So without further ado, let's get started. We'll have our panel join us. I have the honor of moderating our first panel today. It will focus on the incredible research being performed at some of our country's leading national laboratories, which are our national treasures. We're honored to have the skilled leaders from these institutions with us today to discuss new technological advances, current research projects, important issues, and more. And you have their bios in your program. After each panelist has a chance to make opening remarks, we will go into a Q&A discussion. First, I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Brian Anderson, the Director of DOE's National Energy Technology Lab. Dr. Anderson, it's a pleasure to have you with us today.
Well, Vicky, thank you so much for having me, and Sheila as well. And as a matter of fact, it's my second USEA event in 2 days, and really enjoy the events that you convene. As you mentioned, I'm director of the National Energy Technology Laboratory. If you're not familiar with NETL, we are the department's fossil energy laboratory and have been for 111 years. As a matter of fact, 3 sites, one in Pittsburgh, one in Morgantown, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Morgantown, West Virginia, and Albany, Oregon, with a focus really on carbon management. And so when you want to get to know NETL, we have for the last 25 to, well, actually 28 years now, have been working hand in hand with the Office of Fossil Energy, now Fossil Energy and Carbon Management, on developing the technologies for carbon management, be it carbon capture, utilization, and storage, other carbon management technologies to reduce the carbon footprint, like methane emissions mitigation through the methane supply chain, which is a carbon equivalent. And we've been working very heavily on hydrogen production and blue and turquoise hydrogen, if folks are interested in the colors of the rainbow, and integrated energy systems. To give you a little note of NETL, we are the Department of Energy's only government-owned, government-operated laboratory, and so our relationship with the Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management, and we'll hear from the Acting Assistant Secretary for FECM in a moment, but our relationship is management of lots of the research portfolio, as well as working hand in hand on road mapping. And to do this, we have a very large team in integrated systems modeling. This is our strategic systems analysis and engineering group that does everything from life cycle assessment to understand the carbon management value chain, to process optimization, and even the integration of energy systems onto our complex nation's energy system, be it the grid or transportation energy systems. And so for us, it's about quantifying and mitigating carbon emissions, developing the carbon reducing technologies like CCUS and plant efficiency, and also carbon utilization, using our carbon more wisely as we move technologies onto the market and onto the grid. And so specific, just very quickly, because I know we're short on time, I want to keep it brief, but some of our specific areas, like in carbon management, is in the development of carbon capture materials and hydrogen, also the materials, pipeline inspection, and a lot of effort in subsurface characterization. And then also in the area of methane emissions, the production and development of sensor technologies, as well as being able to quantify and reduce methane emissions. And so we're divided in the laboratory in 5 technical core competencies, including computational science and engineering, systems engineering and analysis, materials science and engineering, geologic engineering, and energy systems engineering are our 5 technical core competencies. And so it's really exciting to talk about this subject today and engage in this roundtable. So thanks for having me.
Thank you, Dr. Anderson. Your remarks are very interesting, very intriguing, and hopefully, as we get into Q&A, we can discuss more, because you obviously are working with some of the more important issues of the day. So we'll come back to you, and so thank you for being with us today and providing insight into the incredible work being performed at NTEL. I'm going to say NTEL as opposed to NETL, which it sounds like you prefer. So next we have Dr. Johnny Green of the National Renewable Energy Laboratory.
Thank you, and appreciate this opportunity to share a little bit of information about the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, or NREL, as we call it. We are stewarded by the Department of Energy's Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy, and similar to NETL, we're one of the applied energy laboratories focused on clean energy technologies. So yeah, next slide, please, and I'll be brief here. We're really focused on 3 key areas in our strategy, research strategy. One is what we call integrated energy pathways, which is looking at what's the future energy system look like, where you have more renewables on the grid, and the grid has to operate in a different manner. How do we enable a resilient, secure future energy grid? So that's that top half of the circle on the left. But then also assuming that we have a clean energy future with, I call it low-cost electrons or low-cost electricity, Then we're looking at how do you use those electrons to create chemicals and materials in a low carbon way to decarbonize industry, for example. So that's what we have called electrons to molecules. How do you take those electrons, use catalytic processes to then convert, produce materials and plastics in a more sustainable way. And then the third element is what we call the circular economy for energy materials. And so as we develop these new technologies, how do you make them in a sustainable way? So for example, solar panels, how do you make solar panels more recyclable? Wind blades, how do you make wind blades out of maybe bio-based resins? Those kind of things. And so our strategy is aligned with the Department of Energy's goals to decarbonize the grid, decarbonize transportation, buildings, industry, and also to support a net zero agricultural sector. So next slide, please. So we're really, focused on a transition to a clean energy implementation plan. So as I mentioned, the energy system is changing. A report just came out yesterday from the Department of Energy outlining a potential pathway to have solar be over 40% of energy production in 2050. And so with a grid that has a high amount of wind and solar, as well as other sources such as nuclear, combustion-based generation, a lot of diverse sources, the grid operates differently. You have to look at it in a totally different way. And we're looking at it not just from a technical standpoint, we're also looking at, stakeholder engagement, engaging with communities and seeing what they need and helping them come up with solutions for their constituents. So a few activities that we're currently engaged in, we're looking at a new program to help communities achieve their clean energy goals. It's called Communities to Clean Energy. So that's one initiative that's getting off the ground now. We're partnered with the Department of Energy and there'll be other labs as well. Puerto Rico 100 is another activity that we're looking at how to help Puerto Rico achieve some of their clean energy goals. And there's also out of the Office of Policy, there's what they call a Communities LEAP program to provide technical assistance to communities. And so those are some of the ongoing things to try to help communities transition to clean energy. Okay, so next slide is talking about a new research platform that we have at NREL called Advanced Research on Integrated Energy Systems, or ARES. And this research platform was announced by the Secretary in August of 2020. It's really looking at, once again, the future grid. How do you look at the different size components on the grid at different scales? How do you control large numbers of devices? Let's say in the Bay Area alone, if you look at electric vehicle charging, rooftop solar, just all of the devices on the grid, it could be millions of devices. We don't know how to control those devices right now. So how do we do that? And then also looking at diverse technologies. It could be wind, solar, nuclear, energy storage. How do you get all these different technologies to work together that haven't worked together before? So this research platform provides real experimental assets, some at NREL, some at other labs. And how do you connect and provide, use simulation and experimental hardware to provide what we call a laboratory twin, which is a mix of kind of the elements of a digital twin. It's all simulation and real world demo, and bring those two elements together to what we call a laboratory twin. Okay, next slide, please. So as I mentioned before, we really want to make sure that we have an equitable approach. So just a couple of examples. We actually, a little over a year ago, we partnered with the Cold Climate Housing Research Center in Fairbanks, Alaska, and actually onboarded their staff there. So we actually have a presence. We have a campus in Fairbanks, Alaska, looking at sustainable homes in extreme environments in the Arctic. And we've also done work with Los Angeles. There's been a lot of discussions about, we helped LA look at what they plan to have a sustainable 100% roadmap. So we helped them develop a roadmap. And so they are beginning to work on that right now. So next slide. I think I'm almost at the end here. So last slide. all this has to be done with resilience and security as we build this out. So, you know, it has to be reliable. It has to be secure as we get more of these smart devices. We partner quite a bit with other labs such as Idaho National Labs, NDEA, and others to really build in the security and resilience to make sure that what we're developing can't be threatened by outside attacks. So I'll stop there and hopefully look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Green. That was fascinating. And I have several questions for you later on as well as it relates to the grid technology and the energy transition that you talked about and the threats to the grid and trying to understand all of that. So the work being done at NREL is truly amazing. Next, we have Dr. James Misewish of the Brookhaven National Laboratory.
Morning. Let me start by thanking Vicky, Sheila, and the USEA staff. This is my second USEA event. They're always exciting and very informative. So a few words about Brookhaven National Lab. We are an Office of Science laboratory, and we are the multi-purpose national laboratory in the Northeast. And if there are two things I'd like to convey briefly in my opening remarks. One is regional focus, and the other message I want to convey is partnerships. In many ways, some of the energy challenges are distinct region to region. And we've been focusing on some of the challenges of the Northeast region. We actually are the birthplace of the electric grid in the United States, and we're also the oldest electric grid in the United States. We are characterized by a very dense urban environment, and we have somewhat unique challenges. And the other word, of course, is partnerships. We're working with a lot of the utilities in the Northeast, the Long Island Power Authority, Con Edison, the New York Power Authority, National Grid. And so those are two things that I really wanted to emphasize. So let's talk just for a moment about some of the regional challenges. Others have mentioned already that the new administration has talked about very ambitious solar goals. It was on the front page of the New York Times. New York is actually a leader in ambitious goals and taking steps to achieve them. In fact, New York has enacted something called the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which has set New York State on a path toward sustainable, renewable, net zero energy. And we've got some aggressive goals. So, for example, we're planning in New York 70% renewable energy by 2030. We're planning 9,000 megawatts of offshore wind by 2035. That was 9,000 megawatts of offshore wind, 6,000 megawatts of solar in just the next couple of years, and 3,000 megawatts of energy storage. So New York State has really been out there in trying to set some aggressive goals and actually putting in policies to support those goals. But they're not going to do it alone, and there are some barriers. So toward solving some of those barriers, New York State is home to the National Offshore Wind R&D Consortium, which is funded jointly by the Department of Energy, but that money has been matched by the NYSERDA, the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, locally. And Brookhaven was a part of helping to get that off the ground. NREL's a partner in that. And that is focusing on the actual generation of offshore wind. But national labs take also long-term viewpoints and try to look at long-term challenges and sustainable work that will help us look at those challenges that are just over the horizon. And one of the things that we've been focusing on lately is the integration. If we're going to generate 9,000 megawatts of offshore wind, and by the way, that's half the New York State baseload. You know, our baseload's 18,000, and wow, all of a sudden 9,000 of that coming from offshore. The electrons are going the wrong way. We're used to electrons coming from upstate down to Long Island. Now they're going to be going the opposite way. That's a challenge, and we've got to address that challenge. And so we've been working with our partners to address what we call the big questions. And I'll just put on the table some of those big questions. If we're going to integrate all that renewable energy, there are a couple of things. We know that energy storage is going to be needed, and the state has set goals on energy storage associated with this because of the intermittency of some of the renewable sources. And so we have a couple of big questions that we have to address. What is the right energy storage technology? I'm not sure. I don't think lithium ion is actually going to be that scalable solution that we are going to need in the massive quantities that we're going to need. And so we're looking at other technologies, aqueous electrolyte storage capabilities, for example, that reduce fire hazards, and using more earth abundant materials like zinc and manganese. But then how much do you really need? What do we need to maintain the reliability of the electric grid? You know, we are in New York, the financial capital of the country. We need a reliable electric grid. And so how much storage do we need when we're having massive offshore wind and lots of solar? How much are we going to need in energy storage to keep things reliable? And then finally, where on the electric grid do you put it? And this is a really critical issue. So there's a nexus between the energy storage challenges and the grid challenges that need to be addressed together. Frankly, we want to answer this question with modeling before we try to answer it on the real electric grid. So we're spending a lot of our effort doing things like grid modeling and modeling how massive renewables are going to impact the grid and to address some of those big questions. So Brookhaven brings to the table, you know, we're working very much on those energy storage technologies. We have a national synchrotron light source. We have a nano center. We have tremendous materials efforts that allow us to look at batteries while they're working. We call it operando. We actually look at batteries while they're charging and discharging. This is a new opportunity for us that we're really taking advantage of, and I think it's tremendously accelerating our progress in energy storage. We also, as a national lab, we have tremendous computational and data science capabilities, and that's helping us to do the modeling that we need on the grid. And so we're working with the utilities. Partnership, the other thing I want to mention. We're partners with the other national labs. We're members of the Grid Modernization Lab Consortium, and we bring a lot of the expertise from the nation to New York. We're acting as a portal, and we have our grid modeling expertise locally that we're focusing on these regional challenges. So bringing together the partnership to us is extremely important. So I wanted to, you know, focus on regional and partnership being the themes of my opening. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Misewish. Always fascinating. Thank you for joining us again this year. Very interesting work that you're doing there, and very helpful to understand the different pillars in which you're focused on, being the regional aspect and the partnership aspect. So look forward to hearing more in the discussion. I'd like now to introduce Dr. Marianne Walck from the Idaho National Laboratory. Dr. Walck.
Thank you, Vicky. Glad to be here this morning. Glad to be back with USEA. I am from the Idaho National Laboratory, or we call it INL or INL sometimes. We're in Idaho Falls, Idaho, and we have an 890 square mile site to the west of Idaho Falls, which is started as the National Reactor Testing Station back in 1949. Idaho National Laboratory is the nation's nuclear energy laboratory, and we are managed by the Office of Nuclear Energy of the Department of Energy. We do everything from basic R&D all the way through demonstration scale, and I'll talk a little bit about how we are looking at nuclear to fit into the nation's energy future for the next couple of minutes. Could I have the next slide, please? INL has 5 strategic initiatives, which essentially describe how we're looking at the low carbon energy future. We have 2 nuclear initiatives, one around the fuel cycle and the other around reactors, both existing nuclear reactors and new nuclear for the nations, because as you know, nuclear provides 20% of the nation's electricity and 55% of its low carbon electricity. So we're very focused on that for the clean energy future. We are also very involved in integrated energy systems. You heard both Brian and Johnny mention integrated energy systems. We actually have what we call a tri-lab effort going among the 3 applied energy labs, NREL, NETL, and INL. And we're working very hard on that. INL's part of this is focused on the thermal part of the system and integrating nuclear into that integrated energy system, including hydrogen production. I'll talk about that in a minute. We support that with an initiative on advanced materials and manufacturing for extreme environments. As you can imagine, nuclear and many other energy sources involve extreme environments such as high temperature, pressure, corrosion, radiation. And then we envision this entire system being wrapped in a secure and resilient system. INL has a long history and great expertise in industrial control system cybersecurity, and we are bringing that to bear on the nation's low carbon energy future. Next slide, please. Now I'd like to talk for a minute about what we're envisioning for the timeline for new nuclear in this country. As you know, we are on a precipice here in terms of can we get nuclear into the mix for the nation's energy future, and at INL we believe we can. We have a variety of different projects underway and planned during the next decade. Everything you see here on this slide is planned for the next decade. We are in the middle right now of working on the MARVEL micro reactor, which is in the bottom left of the figure. We hope to have this going by the end of 2023. It is a very small demonstration reactor that INL is building by itself with funding by DOE to show that we can in fact create a new micro reactor in a reasonable amount of time and on budget and it will be used for grid integration and other types of experiments as we move forward. We are developing 2 test beds for microreactor demonstration, which are shown at the bottom of below the line on the slide, the DOME test bed and the Lotus test bed. Both of these are being sponsored by the National Reactor Innovation Center, which is located at INL, but is a multi-laboratory effort from the DOE Department Office of Nuclear Energy. And those would be used to demonstrate some of the microreactor concepts that you see on the slide here. Those would include the Project Pele microreactors, which are being developed through the Department of Defense Special Capabilities Office with the idea of using at forward operating bases and other military applications. These would be transportable, very small microreactors that you could take and install in a location. Obviously would need to be very secure as well. There are a variety of other different reactor concepts illustrated on this slide. I won't go through all of them. We don't have time to do that. But at the end of the decade, we hope also to have the small modular reactor being planned by NuScale and built by the Utah group UAMPS, built at the INL site. So many of these reactors would be built at the INL site for demonstration purposes. And we believe this is a very exciting time for us. We're working on a lot of different technologies, from high temperature gas reactors to molten salt to fast sodium reactors. So we firmly believe that we can get the next generation of nuclear off and running during this decade. Next slide, please. This is my last slide. I'll just mention about how INL is working in the integrated energy systems paradigm. So if you look at the left part of the slide, you see we have an electricity only focus for nuclear today, where nuclear provides heat that spins turbine to make electrons. The potential future energy system could be viewed in a much more integrated way, as Johnny and Brian also mentioned. And here, nuclear could be ranging from large light water reactors to small modular reactors, could provide both electricity and heat to be used for a combination of purposes. It could be used for industrial applications to make hydrogen, desalinate water, make new chemicals, and the like. These systems would also involve many different types of fuel and electric production, including renewables, natural gas with carbon sequestration, for example. So all these things can be put together into this integrated energy system, and INL's part is really looking at the nuclear and the thermal aspects of this future integrated energy system. And so with that, I'll close and turn it back over to Vicky. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Walck. Absolutely wonderful insight into your work. Fascinating, simply amazing to hear about the different concepts being considered over the next several years. Next, we have Dr. Jennifer Wilcox from the Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management of the Department of Energy.
Great. Thank you, Vicki, and thank you, Sheila, for having me here today. Currently acting Assistant Secretary for the Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management. And as Brian mentioned, we updated the name, and that was on July 4th to include carbon management. Really, the office has two separate pillars in terms of RD, D&D investments. One is really associated with the extraction of fossil fuels, whether it's coal, oil, or gas, and minimizing the environmental impacts associated with fossil fuel extraction, like methane mitigation, for instance, and also remediation of some of the legacy associated with fossil fuel, like extraction of critical minerals from acid mine drainage, advanced remediation of produced water from oil and gas, but also from dedicated storage of CO2. The second pillar or second office of focus is really on the carbon management piece. And so this is when we actually take fossil fuels and we generate energy and looking at all of, the environmental impacts associated with that process, carbon management and other co-pollutants, but carbon management being a significant piece. In our office, we are also looking at leveraging, just as Brian said, the last 2 decades of investment that we have made in CCS. A lot of that associated with carbon capture and reliable storage associated with coal combustion. And we're leveraging that expertise to expand, not just to include coal, but also to look at natural gas in terms of the power sector, and to also expand to look at the industrial sectors as well. In particular, looking at cement, steel. When you look at coupling these kinds of industries to carbon capture and reliable storage, you can provide low carbon supply chains to helping others meet their emissions reductions in terms of net zero goals. The other types of industrial sectors that we're investing in are hydrogen, which was also mentioned several different times. Hydrogen, again, from our perspective, from fossil energy, not just natural gas and ensuring that the natural gas supply chain is leak tight. And when we make hydrogen with natural gas as a feedstock today, which by the way, over 90% of the hydrogen that we generate in the United States is through steam methane reforming with natural gas as a feedstock. But when coupled to carbon capture, when coupled to a leak tight supply chain, this can be a reliable approach to making hydrogen. But we're also interested in biomass, sustainably sourced biomass, and being able to understand what that word means. Responsible and sustainably sourced biomass is a whole set of issues in itself, something that we're excited to tackle, that we work with our collaborators in energy efficiency and renewable energy to be able to really identify in a regional basis what biomass is available, what's sustainable. But if those resources are available and you gasify them, you can ultimately create a stream of carbon monoxide and hydrogen, which could be used as a feedstock for fuels. But if you take it one step further and oxidize the carbon monoxide to carbon dioxide in dedicated storage, then you can produce a stream of negative hydrogen. And that becomes quite interesting as a feedstock or even as a power source. And so hydrogen is absolutely something that we're excited about and focusing on. And all of this and all of these efforts are in light of the administration's 3 primary goals. The first one being 50% emissions reduction by 2030, 100% clean electricity by 2035, and then achieving net zero carbon emissions by 2050. And a lot of what we're trying to do is just recognize today what emissions are committed, what emissions are truly difficult to avoid. And so when we look at the committed emissions, we look at, and also thinking about the committed emissions that will actually exist up to mid-century. And that's where we start to think about the industrial sector, as I mentioned, and also the power sector, but not just coal, but also natural gas. And so a lot of what we're trying to invest in is looking at the higher TRL investments that we've made and where those higher TRL investments can lead to pilots and demonstrations. And that leads to siting. This is another important consideration. Where does it make sense to put these plants? Where does it make sense such that you can couple it to dedicated storage deep underground? That's one piece. But the other piece is getting buy-in from the communities. And so something that our office is really increasing focus in is public engagement and engaging with communities, frontline communities in particular, understanding what the impacts and the legacy that fossil fuels have had on communities and listening, and getting to a chance to understand. And you notice that the concerns of the communities are very different depending on what region you're in. The concerns of the communities in North Dakota might be very different from the concerns of the communities in Louisiana, for instance, and different from the region of Appalachia. And so understanding the frontline community concerns, whether it's air pollution, whether it's health impacts, whether it's available and affordable and reliable energy, could also be jobs. And so all of these pieces are aspects that we're taking into consideration when we think about siting pilots and demonstrations, so that we actually are going through the motions in a way that they are sustainable because we have the frontline communities in the discussion and at the table. So that is something that we're really excited about, and we think will lead to solutions that are long-term, beyond this administration, which is really what we need in order to make sure that the planet is here the way it is today for future generations. The last piece that I'll highlight is what net zero means. And so this is a really important concept. For every carbon dioxide molecule we put into the atmosphere, we have to be able to recognize we've got to pull it back out. And that's net zero. And that's the simple math. And so what does it mean? It means that first and foremost, we have to deep decarbonize in every sector and every chance we can. And so this is why we're really excited about the deployment of the tools that we have invested in the last 2 decades on CCS, on the committed infrastructure. Because if we don't do it and we let those emissions go into the atmosphere, we're going to have to pull them back out. And the reality is that the CO2 in the atmosphere is 100 times more dilute than the CO2 in a natural gas-fired power plant, 300 times more dilute than a coal plant, and even more dilute than a cement plant exhaust, and the list goes on. And so we really need to recognize that if we can avoid the emissions today, we should do that. And so another area of focus that we're investing a lot in is a topic called carbon dioxide removal. And this is a suite of approaches where we are actively pulling CO2 back out of the accumulated pool in the atmosphere, and to be distinguished from point source carbon capture. This is the CO2 that's the legacy associated with our dependence on fossil fuels. It's the CO2 that's been accumulating. And the approaches that we have at our disposal today include using minerals that are rich in the Earth's crust that do this naturally already, like magnesium and calcium, but finding ways to accelerate those natural processes. We can also use this through improved forest management, which has significant co-benefits of reducing fire risk in regions that are prone to risk, such in the West, that we've seen a lot of this recently, where our forests are no longer sinks, but becoming carbon sources. And it also using chemicals. And this is actually my background and specialty is as a chemical engineer, is developing strategies to chemically take CO2 out of the atmosphere. And yesterday was a really exciting day. It was the opening in the launch of the largest direct air capture plant on the globe. And that was a Climeworks opening plant in Iceland that had their event yesterday called Orca. And that plant is capable of capturing 4,000 tons of CO2 from the atmosphere. But the interesting part is that in just 3 years, they scaled that approach up by about 10 times. And so it's pretty significant in terms of scale up. And they've cut the costs in half too through that scale up. So really significant progress. And so this is, but I want to also be careful because it's technically feasible to pull CO2 out of the atmosphere does not give us the allowance of business as usual and burning fossil fuels 24/7, because we do have the technologies today to make fossil fuels more sustainable and to avoid the emissions in the first place through technologies like CCS. And so CDR and things like direct air capture should really be used very strategically in order to offset emissions that are hard to avoid, like the aviation sector as a whole. Also, agriculture is another really difficult sector to decarbonize, and shipping. And so there's different sectors that are really, really tough to decarbonize today, which is what we need to do in order to really meet climate goals. And so one of the things that we're trying to do in our office also is decoupling carbon dioxide removal from fossil so that they're not conflated. And that's something that's really important. Because we have the technologies to decarbonize, we should deploy them as much as we can in the near term. Thanks again.
Thank you, Dr. Wilcox. I think I could listen to you for the rest of the day. It was very interesting. Your background's very suited for this area. So thank you. And you've answered several of the questions that I had. I'm going to start with you. As it related to the new title, the final fossil energy and carbon management, and what the new name meant substantially. And I think you have hit on that. And one of the areas, two of the other areas that you mentioned as well, sometimes don't get as much focus as all the science, you know, the 50% by 2030, 2035, then net zero by 2050. You know, all this lingo is what we hear. Public engagement, public acceptance of this. Why should they care about this? Seems to be some of the thinking that I have, having been steeped in all of this for many years in my own professional life. You know, what makes, you know, all of this impact the daily life of someone, and also the international aspect. You did hit on some of that, but to the extent that you have partnerships in those areas, and I was just thinking maybe very quickly you could expand just a little bit, and then we'll want to give some of the other panelists an opportunity as well. So,
sure, I can talk a little bit about the engagement piece. I think the first step, you know, in that engagement is listening and having empathy for the audience. And so an example of that from some of the work that we've already done. So for instance, when you look at New Mexico, there's a lot of opportunity there for dedicated storage of CO2. So putting CO2 deep into the earth. And you also recognize that the region is water limited. And so one of the strategies is as you think about injecting CO2 into the earth, you do not want to overpressurize the reservoir. And so in that process, you're producing water. You're having to take some of the water out. And some of the work that we've been doing is in collaboration with the USGS to be able to overlay where some of the critical minerals, rare earth element deposits are in the United States, how they might overlay with some of these geologic formations. And, you know, the idea there is if we're extracting water from the process, and there's also lithium deposits nearby, chances are that water could also have lithium in it. And so there could be approaches where we have value add through the extraction of critical minerals or rare earth elements from produced water. And if we are to increase renewable penetration into the grid at the rate that we're talking about to get to 100% clean electricity by 2035, the amount of critical minerals and rare earth elements that we're going to need for the magnets, for the batteries, and we're getting a lot of those resources internationally today outside of the United States. And so there's that co-benefit of critical minerals, but at the same time, you're also remediating the water that can then be used in helping to address some of those concerns. Another example is with direct air capture. So with direct air capture, you know, there's a technology out there today using solid sorbents, not that different from what Climeworks is doing in Iceland. And if you're in a region, like let's say that you're nearby a refinery where there's a lot of other hazardous air pollutants, these devices are not just scrubbing the atmosphere for CO2, they're scrubbing the atmosphere of particulate matter, they're scrubbing the atmosphere of sulfur oxides or nitrogen oxides, ozone. And so it's really an opportunity to filter the air, and so that you're not just capturing CO2, but other co-pollutants as well. And so your added benefit there is addressing a community concern. But you have to understand what those concerns are, and they're very different regionally. In terms of international collaborations, we have lots of bilateral and multilateral collaborations. And one example, you know, I'll give is that in the United States, we have invested a lot in CCS, specifically out of the Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management, on approaches, not just we've had a successful project, Petronova, where we looked at we have CCS on coal, a fired power plant, but we also have a blue hydrogen project in Texas, and we have also a carbon capture on a bioethanol plant in Illinois. So we have these projects where we've invested, and those first of a kind investments will help us to get down that learning curve. And by making it down that learning curve means that those technologies will be available at a more economic price for other nations. And so, and especially nations, for instance, like India and China that are heavily reliant on coal, that we can make those first investments and they can benefit from them by paying less. And so those are some of the strategies that we're thinking about.
Thank you, Dr. Wilcox. Dr. Anderson, you mitigating carbon emissions, the whole decarbonization, and you talked about your five, I think, core capabilities. Is there any commercial aspect of that? Are you doing any partnerships with any businesses, or tell us a little more about the focus there? And then I have to get around to the others as well. So
Sure.
Dr. Anderson, can you just expound a little bit?
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, we have 900 different partnerships with 600 different institutions around the country and the globe. So there's a lot of them to talk about. You know, our core mission is to move the technologies to market. And so basically in every technology area that we're working on, whether it's carbon products like graphene materials, all the way to carbon capture materials, we always have most of the time we have either an industrial partner or even a startup or private sector partner that we're trying to get those technologies pushed into, because ultimately if they sit on the shelf at the laboratory, then we're not going to see the benefits. The public sector is not going to see the benefits that we desire to see. And so partnerships is core to basically everything that we do as an applied laboratory. Our sister laboratories in the Office of Science doing fundamental basic research, they still do a lot of partnerships with industry. But we, as the National Lab System, occupy that full value chain from laboratories like in academia all the way through the interface to the private sector. And so lots of them to talk about.
Thank you. I wanted to give you a chance to say that and to let others know how important that effort is. Dr. Green, grid technology, your background, your engineering background. Talk about the energy transition. What does that mean? The energy transition, and as it relates to threats to the grid. We've seen some recent events caused by extreme weather, that impact on the grid. A lot of folks don't understand the grid and obviously how it's built. We don't have time for that, but to the extent that as we're looking at environmental sustainability and we're looking at reliability as well and resilience, maybe talk a little bit about that.
Sure, thanks, Vicky. So yes, there's a lot of the panelists talked about today. You know, the energy system is changing, right? And it's going to have a diverse mix of energy sources, and just it's not one size fits all. It's regional, very complex. And so, couple of things. So, one example that comes to mind, because we've got like the cyber type threat, then we have the natural weather related threat. So for example, when we talk about like a cyber threat, one thing that we've done recently for wind turbine, for example, we put together a consortium with industry and labs and looked at some common issues, cyber issues related to wind turbine technology. And so that's gotten a little bit of publicity lately, and it's something that has got a little bit of visibility. So that's one example of trying to look at, okay, as more wind turbines come online, how do we make sure that they're secure and reliable? So that's addressing one vector. But then we've got, changing extreme weather events, right? And so let's even go, it almost seems like a lifetime ago now, but let's go back to Texas with the big freeze that happened. So, a lot of the generation sources went down, and really, I think one of the main common threads was that a lot of those technologies could have worked in those extreme environments, but they were seen as, hey, this won't happen, or it's very unlikely to happen, and things are changing to where that's happening more often. So with different infrastructure investments, that could have mitigated some of that, even what we've seen recently in terms of Louisiana and the transmission system there. A lot of the transmission system is built to an older standard. So I think a lot of, infrastructure investments can help, with the natural threats, but then we also need to look at the different cyber threats as well. So I'll stop there. And,
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Green. Thank you. Appreciate that expansion. Dr. Misewish, one of the comments you made, look at batteries while they're operating, planning for the integration of new technologies, and also thinking about how much do we need, when we think about storage, how much do we need for reliability? You mentioned some interesting points there, and just more to this energy transition, to trying to integrate those new technologies, recognizing the intermittency or variability, whatever term you might want to use there. Can you just expound a little bit more? I think, are you on mute?
Thank you. I'm always doing that. We all recognize that energy storage is going to be important for integration of renewables, but the big question is how do you do that translation, and how do you get those technologies deployed out in the field? And so, I'll follow up on the point that you and Brian made earlier about partnerships. I just wanted to briefly mention that it's not just about a partnership on technology, and we are, I'm a techie. I love my materials and being in the laboratories, but it's not just a matter of technologies. And we're working with, for example, the New York Battery and Energy Storage Technology Consortium. I'm also on the board of directors of a battery testing center. It's a not-for-profit. And so across the TRLs, we're working on that technology, and national labs are supporting it. But the point I wanted to make in partnerships, we also have to have policies that allow economic investments to enable the translation of those. So one of the partnerships, we do a lot of advising and working with the NYSERDA folks who are advising the Public Service Commission in New York State on the policies that are needed to translate. So, I'm a techie and I love sticking with tech, but we also have to partner with the folks who are developing the economic vision and the policies so that we can invest in those technologies and get them translated out into the field. So let me stop there.
Thank you for that. And lastly, Dr. Walck, something near and dear to my heart, the issue of nuclear, and the nuclear energy laboratory. Obviously, there's different thoughts on nuclear and where you want to go and all that. But I thought it was just fascinating the slide you showed, where over the next few years the different concepts that you're thinking about. So there are going to be breakthroughs in this technology, and to the extent, I know there's lots of views, but to the extent from the standpoint of education and where we're going with nuclear and the technology, how advanced the technology is, maybe you can enlighten us a little bit more on your view about this to some degree. But it's really fascinating to me where we can go with small modular reactors. Oh, I mean, the technology is fascinating, and being able to mitigate some of the concerns that people have surrounding nuclear. So.
Right. Well, that's a question I could talk about for hours.
I
and
know.
Many of our panelists could, but I can't. I'll try to capture a few key points. The nuclear has been very large gigawatt scale light water reactor plants. They have been very, very safe over the period of operation that they have been in for many, many decades, and they continue to be safe. We are engaged both in helping the economics of those plants because of some of the ways some of the markets work. Nuclear plants are currently being closed due to economic reasons, not safety reasons. But we are working with the Department of Energy on light water reactor sustainability. But we are very excited about working on small modular reactors, which use different types of designs, different fuels, have even more enhanced safety features than big light water reactor plants, rely much more on natural and natural cooling and less engineered safety features. So they have even better safety features, and they are smaller and able to be incorporated into these distributed energy grids. And in some cases, for the micro reactors, actually the idea is to build them in a factory and take them to the site, install them, and then after their lifetime is over, remove them. So these are new paradigms for nuclear that we are working on with our many industrial partners, as well as the Office of Nuclear Energy, which is providing funding to both INL and also some of the other national labs that also work on nuclear energy, as well as industrial partners to work together to make those happen. And the key thing is to be able to do it economically within the safety regulations that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission provides, and fast, so that we can impact the low carbon emission future that we want to have. So it's a big challenge, but we are very excited about working on it and looking forward to the next decade and see how it goes.